They were sitting side by side on an old couch in a black and white photograph. The picture was worn around the corners, a little stained, a little bent. She had dirt on her apron. He had dirt on his shirt. And he had his arm around her like they'd just come in from the field, too tired to clean up, but still glad to be close. That was Meg and Joe. By the time I came along, she was Ma'am and he was Pap. But once, long ago, she was just Meg, a quiet young woman with strong hands and a sharper mind than most gave her credit for. And he was Joe, tall and lean, with a smirk that let you know he was going to kiss her before the season was through. They met at church. Of course they did. Back then, that's where you went to worship, to catch up on town gossip, and, if you were lucky, to find someone who looked at you like you were a biscuit on Sunday morning. Joe did just that, and Meg, well, she tried not to smile, but she did anyway. It wasn't long before they were walking home together after service, a Bible tucked under her arm, and his hat held nervously in his hands. They were married before the end of the year, in a simple ceremony, nothing grand, but that marriage would last through 6 children, a war, a depression, and more summers than they could count. Meg moved into the house that Joe had started building himself, with help from his brothers and a borrowed mule. The walls weren't even fully plastered yet, but Meg set about making it a home. That first winter was hard. The crops had been late, the cold came early, and Ma'am, well, she didn't know how to kill a chicken. She'd helped her mama plenty, but helping ain't the same as doing. Joe was out working when she realized supper wouldn't cook itself. She stood in the yard, barefoot on the packed dirt, holding a squawking hen by the feet. And, with more grit than grace, she ended that bird's life, plucked it with the shaking hands, and cooked it over a fire she wasn't entirely sure she had built right. By the time Joe came home, that meal was on the table, though. And she never mentioned the tears that had slipped down her face in the doing of it. Because that's how women like Meg were raised, to get it done, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Years passed. The children came. 1, then 2, then a whole line of them. Babies were born, sometimes right there on the kitchen floor, sometimes in the field when Meg hadn't made it back in time. The farm grew with them. Corn, beans, chickens, pigs. A porch that sagged just enough to creak like a lullaby in the afternoon. And then came the summers when the kids would gather, not just her own, but grandkids and strays and cousins from town, all sitting around the table, shucking corn into buckets while the radio hummed soft in the background. The older girls were in charge of cutting the kernels off with long, careful strokes. Ma'am and her daughters would line the jars up on the counter like soldiers, ready for the canner. Steam would rise from the coal stove, and you could smell the seasons being saved right there in glass. Meg didn't say much during those days. She didn't need to. Her rhythm was in the work, in the steady movements of hands that had done it all before. And once in a while, when a younger girl got distracted or the corn got messy, she'd just glance over her shoulder and raise one eyebrow. That was enough. Meg and Joe were married more than 50 years when she passed. By then, they'd raised children, grandchildren, and probably half the neighborhood. But when I think of her now, I don't think of her funeral. I think of the stories I learned sitting under her kitchen table.